Hi there. Thank you all for being here. I have the unenviable task of getting everyone back from breakfast and in conference mode. But thank you all for being here. My name is Dylan Matthews. I'm a reporter at Vox, and we're going to start today with a panel on what seems to be a very crucial question for ecomodernism, which is, can we have economic growth without wreaking immeasurable damage to the earth? And sort of the crucial thesis of ecomodernism, as I understand it, is that we can. And we're going to be talking through how that's possible and if we're figuring out ways to do that. And Andrew McAfee has a presentation on decoupling as it has been evolving in recent years as a possibility for the future. And I think this is something, I'm not an environmental reporter, but I do write a lot about economic growth, especially in developing countries. And I like to show people this graph that my friend Luke Mulhauser at the Open Philanthropy Project made that he likes to call the history of humanity in one chart. And it's a hockey stick graph, but it's a very happy hockey stick graph. That it's nothing, 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 everything all at once. And the everything all at once happens around 1750. And what you're charting is basically anything you care about. GDP per capita, technological progress as measured by sort of war-making ability, because that's what technology was for a long time, wages such as we know them, ability to extract energy. And so you can look at that chart and say, we were all in brutal, desperate poverty until around 1750 or 1800, and then something suddenly changed. We had this miraculous change in the global economic system that is still gradually spreading across the whole world. We need to be keeping this miracle going. And when I show this chart to friends, they always point out that there is a giant asterisk on that, which is, if this all heats us up to a point that we can't enjoy all that prosperity, what was the point of this? And so I view Andrew's work as trying to remove that asterisk and try to give us a possibility of a world where we can enjoy that miracle without the attendant catastrophes that now seem imminent. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew, and then we'll have Victor and Ariane respond and talk through how decoupling works in practice. So Andrew.
Dylan, thanks very much. That was a great introduction with one serious problem. You stole a big part of my thunder. There's a chart that I want to show that normally elicits a lot of oohs and ahs, and you're like, oh yeah, we knew that already. I'm part of the asterisk removal brigade here today. And I want to talk about a series of ideas that literally got sparked by breakthroughs. And I'm incredibly grateful to this organization because I came across an article that Jesse Ausubel, who I think a lot of us know and know his work, wrote in 2015 in the Breakthrough Journal that made me stop in my tracks and say, that cannot possibly be right. I banged on his evidence. I think he was absolutely right. And I think he was, in a sense, he was being conservative. He was lowballing the phenomenon. So I want to talk about the phenomenon, which has to do with something that I hope we're all interested in, our relationship with the planet that we all live in over time, and how I think we've entered a really new and really profoundly exciting and optimistic new chapter in that relationship. So to talk about the relationship, I want to start with a person of interest in any story about our relationship with our planet. Pop quiz time. Shout it out if you have a guess. No, it's not George Watt. He's in that era. This is James Watt, whose tinkering led us into the Industrial Revolution, demonstrated the first kind of energy-efficient steam engine in 1776, and took us out of the world where we had to rely on wind, water, and muscle power, and got us into the business of tapping into the crazy amounts of energy stored in fossil fuels around the world. And exactly as Dylan says, that changed, I think everything is not too strong a term. It changed at least almost everything. I want to draw a variant of the graph that Dylan described. Luckily, I didn't try to show up with exactly that graph, which would be really boring. But Gregory Clark, who's an economic historian here in California, has just done some beautiful work to chart the trade-off between population and prosperity over time in England, in the birth of the Industrial Revolution. And the world that he describes for centuries was this kind of Malthusian world where the only way that we had prosperity was when population was low, and the only way that we had high populations was when prosperity was low. And I want to show that graph. Here's prosperity on the vertical axis and population on the horizontal axis. And here is 6 centuries of English history. And right now, my graphing skills don't look that good, right? Because all the data is crammed into one tiny corner of the graph. There's a reason for that, which is that in the 2 centuries after the Industrial Revolution, everything changed. And the situation in the UK and the rest of the rich world just absolutely changed essentially overnight, and that Malthusian trade-off between population and prosperity just vanished into the rear-view mirror. I want to switch from the UK to America because we have pretty good data going back a long time. Here's kind of that same time frame. Here's American economic growth from 1800 to 1970. And you just see, with remarkably few exceptions, this steady exponential growth over more than a century and a half, which brought us into a period of previously just unimaginable prosperity. And so that's the happy hockey stick story. Dylan highlighted the big asterisk that comes along with this story. And the asterisk becomes really obvious when you start to look at how we had to take things from the planet to generate this prosperity. So Dylan brought up energy capture. Here's American energy consumption over that same time period. And the correlation here is damn close to 1. We essentially started to use energy consumption as a shorthand for the state of an economy, because for more than a century and a half, that relationship was just absolutely tight. If we home in on the 20th century, again, the black line is real GDP for America, and those gray lines are different kinds of resource consumption over time in the country. And again, you see exponential growth in the economy. That's awesome. You see exponential growth in the amount of resources we needed to generate that economy. This incredibly tight relationship. And in the years leading up to 1970, we were using more year after year. The growth rates in things like fertilizer use and aluminum use were even higher than they were for the economy as a whole. And like you can imagine, around 1970, people started to look at this kind of evidence and said, gang, this cannot continue. We can't keep doing this. We're living on a finite planet. And we had our first Earth Day in 1970. And around the time of the first Earth Day, there is a series of books trying to sound the alarm about the fact that this relationship was very tight, was very exponential, and could not go on indefinitely. A lot of us remember the population bomb. That's the sunniest subtitle I've ever seen on a book, right? While you are reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation, most of them children. Right? That flies off the shelf when you write a book like that. Barry Commoner wrote about the fact that we had to change the way that we took resources from the planet and our basic relationship with it. A team of modelers at MIT, my home, wrote this very popular book in 1972, predicting that unless we basically harnessed control of the economy and embraced central planning in a big way, we were just going to flat run out of everything that matters by the middle of the 21st century. And then finally, I think this is my favorite. I don't think that title needs an exclamation point. I think that's a little bit of overkill. But when you go back and you read the dominant views around the time of Earth Day, I don't think I'm cherry picking. The tone was somewhere between alarmed and absolutely apocalyptic about the fact that we were growing at this incredibly steady kind of clockwork rate and exploiting our planet increasingly as we were doing so. And if you look more broadly than just resource use, you get even more frightened. This is pollution. Sulfur dioxide pollution in America in the years leading up to Earth Day. Our atmosphere was about close to twice as polluted over the course of our measurement here. And we made these moral mistakes, right? This is the largest animal that ever lived on the planet. This is the blue whale. We hunted them down in absolutely nightmarish numbers over the course of the 20th century for no very good reason. We used blue whales to make margarine and soap and lubricants and things like that. We had other sources of these. These were just efficient. There were, by one count, approximately 250,000 blue whales in the southern oceans at the start of the 20th century. By 1970, there were about 500 individual animals left out there. So you can look at this pattern and start to get very, very worried and very unhappy about what we were doing to our planet as we continued to grow our populations and our economies. And especially when you think about the low-income parts of the world, and they were going to rise up that exponential curve in very big numbers, you start to understand the alarmism a little bit. I think my single favorite quote that summarizes this kind of gloomy view about the future and what was going to happen comes from this book, Ecology as Politics, where he said, look, zero growth is not sufficient here. We have to embrace a philosophy of degrowth, of voluntarily becoming poorer over time, plus probably less numerous as well, but poorer over time, because those graphs, versions of those graphs, are just, this conclusions just jump off the page at you. We can't keep doing this. The only sustainable growth is degrowth, is a slogan that we've seen. I want to make one thing really, really clear. We did not embrace degrowth. That is not a thing that has happened in the year since Earth Day, in the year since 1975. I want to show that. I'm going to keep drawing the graph of American GDP over time, and that dotted line is America's industrial production, just the amount of heavy stuff that we turned out. In the year since Earth Day, the economic growth rate has slowed down a bit. A bit is about the most you can say about that, and you can't look at the aggregate evidence and find any signs of large-scale degrowth or turning our backs on population and prosperity increases in America and the rest of the rich world. But something pretty fundamental did happen and change, and I want to draw the graph that got me started on this whole path and led to the book More from Less, and it's Jesse Ausubel's graph, because he had the great idea not to stop at 1970, but to keep drawing the graph forward about total American consumption. This is not per capita, this is total American consumption, including imports and exports, and globalization is not the story here, about what happened in the years since Earth Day to our use of some of the most important molecules for an economy. And when you do that, these are metals, and you keep drawing the graph, and something weird happened. We plateaued, and we started decreasing. We started decreasing our aggregate consumption of these molecular, literal building blocks for an economy. I thought this was an amazing graph, and I wondered what that looked like when you overlay GDP, the size of the economy, on it. When you do that, the situation becomes even more stark, I think. You just notice this profound, large-scale, pretty broad-based decoupling going on. I want to draw a couple different versions of that graph. The black line will stay the same. That's the size of the overall economy over time. Here are building materials, and you see the effects of the Great Recession. It just caused a halt to construction activity. Maybe we're going to rebound in our use of sand and gravel, because the job of those resources is to be heavy and take up space. But those bottom two lines are paper and timber. And our year of peak timber and peak paper was back in the 90s in America. There's just been massive decoupling, dematerialization using those resources. If we look at the agricultural sector, the pattern is very similar. The black line there is the total tonnage of crops year by year that comes out of America. We're an agricultural juggernaut. We continue to be. Those other lines are the inputs, the molecular inputs to agriculture. They are fertilizer, water for irrigation, and acres of cropland. We're post-peak in all of them. We've decoupled growth and agricultural output from the inputs to it. That bottom line is kind of that nice, slow, steady, gradual descent. That's deceptive. The numbers are actually quite big. Since the early 80s, we have given an amount of farmland back to nature equal in size to the state of Washington. We're just not farming on that land anymore, but we're quite literally getting more from less here. The last one of these graphs I want to draw is, again, going back and looking at energy use in America. Remember, up until 1970, there was just about a one-for-one relationship, so that we used it as shorthand. Energy use is a proxy for the size and the state of the economy. Absolutely not anymore. We've just thoroughly decoupled energy use from growing the economy. We've decoupled CO2 emissions even more, largely because of the fracking revolution. This is not a graph that should encourage complacency at all. That number needs to go down much more quickly than it is. But we have engaged in this pretty profound decoupling. And then the question that I really tried to dig in on in the book is, what caused this to happen? If it wasn't voluntary embrace of degrowth, what did cause this to happen. And my answer to it really hinges on the obvious source, which is a Radio Shack ad from 1991. Literally, there was a retired newsman who went around buying up old copies of the Buffalo News as a hobby, and he highlighted that he found this Radio Shack ad from 1991 in an old physical newspaper, and he said there are 15 gizmos on this page. 13 of them have vanished into this thing that we all carry in our pockets. And his point was that that is a lot of metal, paper, components that we need in absolute terms fewer of, and adding on to that, we print out many fewer maps. We don't have atlases in our cars, physical CDs and DVDs and tape players. All that stuff is dematerialized down into the smartphone. And as I looked around, you can find no shortage of examples of this. Cars today are simultaneously lighter, faster, and more fuel efficient, and much less polluting than they were a couple generations ago. The average car engine is about 40% lighter and higher horsepower than it was a generation or two ago. The last story of this I want to tell, I was talking about an early, when I was in the middle of this book, I was talking about it with a friend of mine who's had a long career, and he said, my first job out of undergraduate, I worked for a railroad, and my assignment was to figure out where our cars were around the country. I said, what? He said, look, this was 1968, and the lore in the industry was that about 5% of our rolling stock rolled on any given day. And it wasn't because the other 95% needed to rest. It was because we literally didn't know where they were. And we used to employ people to stand at railroad crossings and watch trains go by and telegraph back to the head office when one of our cars passed. That's why you've got those codes on the side of a rail car. I don't think I need to point out, we don't do that anymore. And every railroad knows where every one of these 30-ton pieces of equipment is. Therefore, you need fewer of them. So the story I'm telling you is about this 1-2 punch of kind of capitalism, vicious competition, trying to save money, and tech progress that allows you to save money. And the question that I hope is on people's minds is, am I saying this is sufficient? This is absolutely not sufficient, because anyone who's taken Econ 101 knows about things called externalities, like pollution, that are costs or benefits that don't go to the direct participants in a transaction, but are still pretty important. Pollution is always exhibit A in your externality. So my view is we need another pair of forces to enter the picture, which is public awareness. This was the great triumph of Earth Day and the environmental movement, to say, why don't we stop doing these things? And responsive governments that listen to us and put in place decent policies. Instead of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, my phrase for these is the Four Horsemen of the Optimist. And when all four are in place, I actually get pretty calm that the decoupling will continue. So we passed landmark legislation over and over again. As a result, this is what's happened to our air pollution levels in America. It's just been an incredible triumph. Needs to go down even more. Again, I'm not trying to encourage complacency, but this has been a big deal. These were our friends, the whales, when we left them in 1972. They are coming back. There are something like 25,000 of these animals in the oceans these days. Nature is resilient. It will bounce back if we give it a chance. I'm going to end with my all-time favorite picture about ecomodernism. The whales are coming back. They're now visible off the coast of New York City. Thanks very much.
So I think Victor, we'll have Victor respond, and then Ariane, and then we'll open it up for dialogue.
Thank you. Let's see how this works. Can you put up my slides, please? Great, they're on. All right, hi. I haven't read the actual book, to be honest.
I just finished writing it.
Yeah, I know, but I will offer a few reflections just on the topic from my point of view. This is, I mean, some of you might have seen it, all of you might have seen it, but I think to me this is the basis for all discussions about our future and sustainability, the long-term view of the planet and how climate has changed over deep time on planet Earth. And of course, there have been changes, like starting 60 million years ago, particularly in this graph. But of course, this domain of stability called the Holocene, 10,000 years ago, where we have flourished as a species, our economies, democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, a dangerous future, as I see. The projections by the IPCC with changes that we haven't seen or experienced as a species. This is not new to you, of course, but as a context of why decoupling is so important, right? It's going to define to what future we move into. One of the things, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative here without reading the actual book, is the fact that we need to get the story right. We need to measure the right factors to be able to say whether we're actually decoupling. And my summary, and I see the risk of the whole ecomodernist project, will look a little bit like this. Let's see. So unless you capture what really matters in the Earth system and the operation of the Earth system, you're not actually contributing or understanding what the role of decoupling in that context. I think that little video is from Russia. So let me just give you an example of things that I find fascinating and also a little bit scary. I mean, I know there are a lot of experts in the room, so this will be a quick pop science summary of something called tipping elements in the Earth system. So essentially points in the operation of the Earth system that pushed beyond a threshold might actually lead to very big repercussions on the climate system on a very, very long time scale, but of very high relevance. Some of them colored blue, essentially polar ice melting. Others are related to biomes, living biomes, and others doing with circulation in the atmosphere and oceans. Once we start looking into these tipping elements, and the interesting thing with tipping elements is that whether we manage to stay within these tipping points will define the future of our climate in a very long-term perspective. That would be my argument. And if we start to look into data on how these tipping elements are changing, instead of looking into metals or other types of metrics, it's not looking very hopeful, right? So if we talk about Greenland, we could probably also add the Arctic. That's another point. And data on the Brazilian Amazon, something that we have studied a little bit more in detail. We see massive droughts in the Amazon at the same time as deforestation continues, right? So there was a slowdown in deforestation, but now it's accelerating again thanks to a new president. Another thing that we are very familiar with, of course, are coral reef ecosystems, close and rapid degradation. Boreal forests in Canada have for a very long time moved from being a remover of carbon to actually add carbon to the atmosphere for the last decade. And so the story goes. I mean, I could probably give you 20 more indicators. I'm surprised that you didn't mention the last IPBES report on biodiversity loss. We could talk about global inequality metrics, et cetera, et cetera. I think my key point here, and this is the message for the whole decoupling movement or ambition, is the fact that when you're dealing with systems that have thresholds, and we can discuss which systems have and don't have thresholds. Actually, these systems don't care about trends. They care about aggregate impacts. So if you think about the Amazon as a system with a threshold doesn't care about whether deforestation is decreasing or not. You're still moving closer to the threshold. You're doing it slower, but you're still moving to the threshold. And I think that needs to be considered in a serious way when you think about decoupling. But we are seeing partial decoupling, I would say. This is a very interesting paper in Nature Climate Change, came out, I think, this year, that shows and looks at 18 countries in the world where you actually do see a decrease of CO2 emissions, even if you integrate exports and imports. So this is massively interesting. So you have Sweden in there, but actually the last year they have increased again. You have the US. If I remember correctly, I think you do see an increase in the US as well in 2018. I think your graph went to 2017. But what's interesting here is, of course, why is this happening? Why do we see this? What's the underlying theory of decoupling? And the analysis in this paper is quite interesting, quite robust. You get to see three different things that these countries have in common. First of all, they're phasing out fossil fuels. Second, they're decreasing energy use. And third, there's very strong political signaling, lots of policies. But on the other hand, and my background is in political science, my feeling is that we have no idea what's going on. I mean, they're essentially just explaining what we're seeing. I don't think it has to do with popular opinion. I don't think it's something deeper that these 18 countries have in common. I don't see sort of the underlying theory of why we're seeing this. I think there's multiple things happening at the same time, but the picture is a little bit vague. So that would be my takeaway. I think we've had a little bit of discussions between our center and the Breakthrough Institute. I'm looking at you, Earl. But I think we all share the ambition to create a good Anthropocene. I mean, I have that too. And part of that is envisioning a better future. What will a better and a good Anthropocene look like? But in that, we also need to understand the present and talk about what's happening now in a serious and honest way. So how we talk about the present matters. How we talk about decoupling matters. And I think this is a good opportunity to make sure we get it right. Thank you.
I think that's the first presentation I've ever seen at a conference like this that went under time. So thank you, Victor. Ariane.
Thanks, Dylan. Good morning, everyone. Well, so I definitely thank Andrew for producing this work. It's a really important contribution. I'm working in the global environmental change community right now, where the limits conversation seems to have come back with a pretty great force. And so it's a really critical time. And I also really thank Victor for bringing in this critical systems perspective. I mean, these are really wicked problems, and they're highlighted by the degree of uncertainty we have about the Earth system, but also in terms of what pathways humans can really take that will actually work. And so when we look at the megatrends of dematerialization and decoupling that Andrew laid out here, one of the things that can be really hard to do is to connect to how this is all playing out on the ground, in terms of people's livelihoods, in terms of landscapes around the globe. And that's sort of what I hope to do in the next 5-6 minutes, is to consider this idea. How we govern decoupling is perhaps more important, that I would argue, as to whether or not decoupling is actually happening. I study land systems and the workings of our global agricultural commodity crop production system, and we can only see stories and data that tell us that it's the policies and institutions that we're creating to manage these transitions that will determine how this actually goes down and whether or not we're moving towards the good Anthropocene that we want. So, I mean, for me, it's all about governing decoupling. So just to kind of get us on, there we go, okay. So what does agricultural intensification have to do with material decoupling and ecomodernism? Not everybody in this room studies agriculture. It's one of the things I love about Breakthrough. Esther Bostrup, in the corner there, importantly gave us the theory of agricultural intensification. So she was an economist specializing in development of agriculture, and she worked for the United Nations. And in 1965, she coined the term agricultural intensification to describe how growing populations would lead to more intensive farming. And so put simply, if you're a rice farmer in Myanmar and you have a growing family and you need to produce more food, you're going to intensify your farming methods, shorter fallows, building irrigation canals, or using animal traction to assure that you can produce enough to meet your family's food needs. So with intensification, you can produce more food from the same amount of land. It's the modalities of intensification have gone way beyond this now, but at the heart of the eco-modernist premise of making a good Anthropocene is material decoupling, and as Dylan said, and agricultural intensification in land systems is the most important part of that material decoupling. So you have to intensify agriculture to be able to achieve the benefits for nature that we wanted, or that we want. So, in the big picture, we look at this figure. This is created by Breakthrough Fellow Earl Ellis. It's out in Science next week, and we see, as Andrew describes, these recent global trends and future trajectories of land use and population, and they're showing that even as populations grow rapidly in the second half of the 20th century, we have more food produced per person and per unit area of land over time. This is sustaining progressively richer diets without substantially increasing the overall use of Earth's land. So the trends are super exciting, and we should be excited about it. These are really good trends. This is Rosling's washing machine right here, in Laos. Eco-modernists want everyone in the developing world, I should say men and women, to have washing machines, right? But this tremendously good fortune for humans, unless governed effectively, will not necessarily bring about the changes that we want. So the question I had for Andrew, is, are the Four Horsemen in sync? Can we rely on the Four Horsemen to ride together without running each other off the road? capitalism, technological progress, responsive governments, right, and aware publics? Or can we even rely on the fact that they're in the same race? What if you've got donkeys and horses against each other? We know there's a lot of progeny of them in the race. I don't think we can. And therein, I think, lies in our potential for failure, and conversely, our chances to turn this around. So when we look at land change today, what's driving land use? It's telecoupled. That's the big story. Increasing global interconnectivity is influencing land system change. It's the core. And these transnational flows of capital, commodity, energy, people, and waste are spanning multiple territorial jurisdictions. So this is a map by Javier Godard. He's also at Stockholm Environmental Institute with Victor from a new supply chain transparency initiative called TRACE. And with these types of tools, we can begin to build and track these relationships over time, which we need that level of granularity to be able to understand how these systems are working. But the point here is that the effective governance of these systems requires collective decision-making and negotiation among governments and firms and land users and financial actors and others. And I think it goes beyond just aware publics and responsive governments. I think we need to know more about how these various actors are behaving. And so, we know that land systems are increasingly the site of competing claims for food production, for energy consumption, for conservation, for carbon sequestration. This is a banana and tree plantation in Laos. In my mind, when I look at it, I think, what is here? Is this a crisis story? Depending on who you ask and at what scale you're evaluating, you don't know, right? Local people here are benefiting from better roads. There's probably schools nearby. There's actually clinics. Or they may have been displaced from ancestral lands. It could have been right there. Or it may actually be both. And the issue is, for nature, this isn't a clear story either. There could be land spared somewhere else, but we don't know at what scale and for what benefit. None of this is really being governed at this point. That's the reality. Right now, none of this is really being governed, and so we don't know. So the big story, these are land deals, global land deals, over 200 hectares from 2000 to the present. And so we call these large-scale land acquisitions. And I've been doing some work to track them globally. And the rate of expansion of agricultural land area might be slowing, but it is still expanding. And it's also shifting, importantly, from one region to the other, from the temperate zones to the tropics and within regions. And I've been tracking these deals globally to try to get a sense of the causes and consequences of land change. And in many places, these deals are happening in really perverse ways. So this is just one example from a wildlife sanctuary in Cambodia, and the incursion from 2008 onward when the food price, financial crisis, triple event. And this is the advancing of the oil palm frontier into the reserve. And here, in Cambodia, we found just last week, we did some analysis, 26% of all forest loss in the country over that 16-year period is from these economic land concessions, and that is 6% of Cambodia's total forest cover. So we play this forward, and we have to ask what that type of system is going to get us. And so for the reasons I've just explained, we don't really know the proportion of decoupling versus intensification that we're seeing in the US or Europe. Is it really all decoupling, or is some of it displacement into other parts of the world? And so then this is another sort of just a bigger picture of the same kind of story. This is this push-pull with arrows indicating the direction of production flows in millions of global hectares. And the point here is just that the high-income countries require more biologically productive land per capita than low-income countries. But this connection can only be identified if you actually quantify land produced internationally traded products, right? Because higher income countries tend to displace a larger fraction of their land use. And so we need to kind of pull this into the story. Shifting gears again, another perspective on this decoupling story I really want us to take seriously is the way we're experiencing dematerialization and decoupling as Western developed nations, how everyone else is experiencing it, right? These girls are working with their families to load trucks that are going to China with bananas from Laos. And the lands that they lived on before these banana plantations were rice. And they can't actually, because of what's been done to the soil, go back to rice now if this banana boom were to stop. It puts them in a different vulnerable position. So what would some of the experiences look like on the front lines of accumulation and transformation of nature be like if we're not all Americans? And how are we failing to govern these transitions? And how can we do better? I'm all for that. And will decoupling, I guess the big question is, will decoupling happen fast enough to avoid these outcomes and get the kind of good Anthropocene that we want? So this last two closing points, I do think, what are the ways forward? Inducing intensification is a really important part of that. So just as population growth at the very beginning we were talking about could induce intensification in farm systems in Bostrup's time, we can also use policies to govern and induce intensification for the goals that we have to produce more with less and spare land for nature. But it's really important that these policies be integral to land use planning, so that intensification is a part of an overall land planning concept where conservation is a sort of an equal partner in that process and not an add-on or an afterthought. And there's so many promising examples of this working. I don't have time to go into them, but Brazil's recent history suggests that restrictive forest conservation policies and better development of ag supply chains in the short term are having really good effects on forest conservation. But in the long term, it's not really secure because we have these rebound effects still happening where other land is again displaced to other areas. But I guess what's really important is we need to focus, and I guess on the governance side is it's not just governing the territories, it's governing the flows. And that just requires different kinds of tools, and we have to be really thoughtful on how to do that. All right, so what do we do? If my kids who are here in the audience today look back on this day 50 years from now, will they tell us that decoupling was a success, or was it a marginal part of the human story on planet Earth? Until we can lock down this global story on decoupling, it'll be hard to say. How much is really going to happen? When you have development, do you get more responsive governments? Which is, I think, what we're hoping. How far does material decoupling go, and how much of it is just displacement? And I think we don't know yet. It's hard to compute the actual net material decoupling in a world that's so tightly coupled in terms of how we shape outcomes. So it might be dangerous to say that we're decoupling globally now, but I think saying that we can is already a really big step, and that's why this is a really good move forward. And now for ecomodernism, the hard question, right? What are the strategies that matter? And what are the actions that we need to take? Is it doing everything we're already doing, but just doing more of that? More responsive governments, adds more to that, push forward the aware publics, or is it a whole different level of response that's required? And one that's really strategically different from what we've done in the past. And I think there's so many people in the room that can actually help answer that question. So I look forward to our discussion.